As of late, I've done my very best to begin not with some preamble or opening hello or remark, but instead with driving straight into the scriptures and trying to capture our hearts and imaginations. But I feel like on a day like today, we almost have to address the elephant that trampled through our yard before we can really get to understand why we're really gathered. So if you'll permit me a moment or two to share a few things, I might help the community at large. I know many of you have heard from us through social media, the website, our email, but new information is coming, and we're just trying to share what we can as we're able. We know, for example, that there is damage to the roof above the parish hall in particular, and in fact, the mighty wind that blew all 4 roof unit air conditioners completely off of their bases, and they can't be reset until the roof has been examined, which will happen on Tuesday, you'll take comfort to know. And in the meantime, we have air conditioning in here, although it may not always feel like it, but not in the parish hall, narthex, parlor, choir room. Sorry. So you'll see that you'll do well to enter quickly and enjoy this space while repairs are being made and trying to avoid some of the other spaces. Our class continues in the conference room where we are still blessed with air conditioning. Thanks be to God. So more information will be forthcoming on all of that. I don't want to spend too long on it, but I do think making sure folks know what's happening is an important part of when and how we gather as well. So now, Trinity Sunday. I have many things left to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. It sounds so much better when Jesus says it in the gospel than when you hear your preacher begin with that, I suppose. And indeed, Mother Marcy is right. It is a rare occasion when these 2 days, the day of Father's Day and Trinity Sunday, align like this. And given that I spent less time at my desk and more time looking at trees this week, I couldn't help but be caught up a little bit in the notion of how this father-son relationship exists both in the Trinity and in our own lives. My son was at camp helping with various other things, and in the kitchen there when I really wanted him to be dragging branches with me. But it left me thinking in particular about my relationship with my father. And in all fairness, I think that when we tried to describe God as Father, that's the kind of relationship we have in mind because it's rather ideal, the relationship that he and I share. Many of you have had the opportunity to meet him, and he's even preached here, and you've probably exhibited that or recognized that we exhibit many of the same characteristics. We're both handsome. We both talk a lot. We both love our families and our pets. But in all seriousness, we have spent an extraordinary amount of time together and shared a lot of common experiences. But I'll have to tell you that even as a very young child, I was more attached to my mother, and you've heard me speak very highly of her as well. My dad almost had to lure me away with promises of stops for donuts and things, to entice me to come along with him to different things. And the reluctance may have carried down from my sisters, who learned very quickly that a lot of times going with Dad meant that at somewhere along the line there was a job to be done. We are German. And a stop at the store, the grocery store that he owned, just to check in. That's where we got the donuts usually. Fortunately, they had a fantastic bakery there, and so it didn't really bother me to sit for a little bit while he checked in with folks. But I'd be lying if I said that the relationship I had with my dad is he drove us to that store and so many other places, and when he gave me money to go buy donuts, he doesn't do that anymore. The relationship has changed, substantially even, and it changed not quickly, not day by day, not even week by week. Not even necessarily very much from one year to the next, but over time it's changed substantially. A few moments in our relationship really stand out to me. We did a lot of outdoor work together. I did miss him this week too, not just my son, but my dad. He actually, for a moment, thought about coming up from Houston to help with the cleanup after the elephant trampled through the yard. And I can still remember the day that I realized that I had grown to be stronger than him. Now, it surprised me, to be real honest, because I could still see my dad, and he was always this big, strong man, and his arms were still so much bigger than mine, and it didn't look. And then one day we went to move a really big log, and I could pick up one end, and he couldn't. And I knew that things were changing. He was still very much in charge of the situation. He laughed heartily when he figured out that I could lift it, and he couldn't. He said, "Now put it on the truck." Which I couldn't do without his help, so he pushed one end while I lifted the other. But I knew things were a little bit different. And they continued to change over time. In part, I still remember I was very excited as a young priest. I found a fantastic continuing education opportunity that was in England. And I called my dad to see if he wanted to go with me. Since he's a clergy person as well, I thought this is a great way. We used to travel all the time together, and it had been about 15 years since it had been just the two of us. And so we arranged to meet each other at the airport in Atlanta and fly to England together. And we were both so excited, even though I was very tired from already having flown to Atlanta. I thought I'd nap. It was like an overnight flight, but I think we talked the entire way. And we got there, and once again, we took each of us our favorite place in the car, him on the left, me on the right. But somehow things were different. And he was glad that they were different. As we pulled out of the airport in London, he was very grateful to not be driving. And that afternoon, I recognized that things indeed were different as I continued to drive, and he dozed in the passenger seat, and I thought, full-on role reversal. And even more so as we wandered through some of the towns, and he would seem to kind of lose his way, not because he wasn't capable of keeping track of where we were, but he didn't worry about it because he knew somebody else was. I think so often when we think of the Trinity, we get entrenched in our ideas of what each role is to us and to our society. We think Father in the very notion of why God was named Father early in Judaism, the notion of patriarch and responsibility and ownership. It was kingship without the domineering and ineffectual parts of it. When we refer to God as Father, we're thinking of the most ideal father-son relationship possible. And it helps us to recognize the sacrifice that is asked of the Son. And we see the intimacy of the relationship between the Father and Son as something to be modeled for us in a way that we might strive to have these kinds of relationships with others while we walk and aim to follow Jesus. But I hope we don't forget God knows no time, isn't bound by time, isn't structured the same way, and that relationship between Father and Son isn't so staunch that it can't be flipped from time to time, and that it is indeed one of those kinds of relationships that's infinitely complex. And then we add in the Spirit. And we recognize that all three persons of this Trinity of being exist from the beginning of time. As we read back through our Hebrew scriptures and watch as the Spirit hovers over the deep as things are formed. We see the preeminent Christ figure in the speech of the prophets. And our hope and expectation of each person of this Trinity is cultivated over time and enriched to our understanding. And we're blessed by this Trinity of persons in many ways. Indeed, many of us may struggle with a relationship with one aspect or another of the Trinity. I've got a great friend who's a priest who says, I love Jesus, but I really like his dad even better. And that's just to say that he feels like he is more in tune and able to commune and pray through God the Father and has a better understanding. I mean, if I had to pick one, I'd probably go with Spirit, but that probably doesn't surprise anybody here. So we each of us have this opportunity to relate not just to one aspect of the Trinity, but fully all through them. But more than that, in the Trinity is modeled for us a perpetual perfection of communication. God in one person is directive. God in three persons is codependent and relies on the other persons of the Trinity. Cajoled into deep and deeper communication within God's self. Those of us living in relationships and in families, or even just in friendships, recognize the absolute essential nature of communication to build upon a relationship of love. And so God models it for us in the Trinity. So I hope that this Trinity Sunday we might relinquish some of the old understandings of what our idea of the Trinity was, only to leave room for our idea of God to grow. I hope we continue to look at the persons of the Trinity in all their perfection as a model of communication that might draw us into relationship with one another and with God. And an image that may help us. Many may be familiar with the Trinity of the icon. I have a copy of it in my office. The three persons of the Trinity sitting at table together in communion. And on this ancient artifact that is for us a representation of this three persons of God, there is a mark upon it. And I love the idea shared by some scholars that say that originally there hung a mirror. And in that mirror, we see our reflection in perfect communion and relationship with all three persons of the Trinity. We take our place at the table that we might understand God and one another more fully. Here we find the essence of why we gather.